I trekked around Geis16 for about 3 days, and I went to places that I had old photographs of, and places where people told me that they had lived, and so I videotaped it. I first went to the Rapanecker section, and then I had a tour guide of the Wilhelmshohe section, and then I went to Schlosshalde. I took film of the castle. I went to the cemetery with their Estonian monument there. In 1970, that was my first visit to Geis16, and I had old photographs, and the chimney and the electric company, which is right across the river there from Hospital Wieler, were my landmarks. So this huge chimney in Geis16 was easy to spot when I came to the train station. There's only two large, in 1970 there were the two large chimneys still there. And one is over by the milk factory, and then there's one for the electric company. The electric company is right where I live. So I used that as a guide. I walked straight to the electric company using the huge chimney that I could see. And then as soon as I got there, I recognized the building from old pictures that I had. And there's a path in the back. I walked back to the path. And in 1970, the pictures were almost identical to my 1945 pictures. I could even match my backyard, where I had some photographs of a bunch of us in the back. And I was able to match up the windows and the backyards. And it's funny, even the grass and the sidewalk looked identical to a 1945 photograph. From this photograph, I was able to find the back of my old house. That's me, my mother, Mai's mother, and Mai lived on the 3rd floor. My mother tells me there were people that actually lived in the attic of that building also, and they would go through our apartment to get there. And it's interesting, my mother said that we had to go through Linda Saar's apartment to get to our apartment, because I think the buildings were just divided up into like several families. They were probably one apartment, but then 3 or 4 Estonian families lived there. So we used the common kitchen, and we had a blanket in between to divide some of the rooms up. But people had to pass through our apartment to get to the 3rd floor. Geis16 is where my memories really start. I came to Geis16 I was born in June 1944. We came to Geis16 in 1945. So I don't really, I was born in Tartu. My mother says we happened to catch the last train out of Tartu to I think we went to Tallinn, and we got a ship at night. And from there, it's kind of foggy where we actually went, because there was a lot of ships were torpedoed and bombed. My mother tells me we came into Germany, but there was a lot of bombing going on, so we actually went back a little bit. We went through Czechoslovakia. So from what my mother tells me, we zigzagged around Czechoslovakia. We never really went into Poland, but we came into Germany. But to avoid, the Americans were bombing the heck out of northern Germany. So we kind of went back and forth to avoid the bombing at that time. And we spent some time in Czechoslovakia. We came into Germany. My mother doesn't recall some of the towns in Germany we were in, but that she does remember that we were in other towns before Geis16. In 1970, when I went there, my mother always talked about how we lived we lived in Rapanecker. And I didn't even know there was a street named Rapanecker. We lived on Hospital Wieler, which my mother, couldn't even remember the street, but she knew we lived in Rapanecker. It turns out Rapanecker Strasse, a lot of Estonians, matter of fact, all the houses on both sides of Rapanecker Strasse, Estonians lived in. And it went a little bit further in that area. There were some Estonians lived on Weingarten, which is the next street that runs parallel. Another large group lived in Wilhelmskonko, or Wilhelmshohe, which the Germans pronounce it that way, Hohe. There were probably a couple thousand, and I also lived there at one time. I lived in 107. We lived there My mother said we lived there for a couple months, and she met my stepfather there. Jacob lived there for a while. He worked for the U.S. Army. He was into photography. That's why I think I have so many old photographs of Geis16, because in the Army, that's what he did. He was their photographer, worked in the darkroom. The papers and documents that I've seen over the years, there were about 100 DP camps located in Germany, in the French, British, and English, American sector. And what happened was, there seemed to be a push to move most of the displaced persons into the American sector. And from maps in a couple books that I've seen, a lot of Estonians came from the different DP camps. They were sent to Geis16. So from 1945 to about 1949, the people on these other camps were transferred to Geis16, and the numbers, Geis16 became the largest DP camp in like 1947 or maybe 1949. The numbers reached, from what I've seen, almost 5,000 Estonians. I think 1948, when the largest amount of Estonians lived there. And in 1949, the DP camp, the program ended in 1949. So and I talked to Sylvia Kirsimägi about that, and she said that the Estonians weren't forced to leave, but most of them did, because they occupied, homes of Germans. And so most of them, if you got a sponsor somewhere, you went, if you had a sponsor, like we got a sponsor in Philadelphia, we went to the U.S. And from what my mother told me, if you didn't have a sponsor, you were shipped to Australia. A student was going to do a paper on how the Germans felt about the Estonians. Germans actually disliked the Estonians. And they didn't have very kind words about how the Estonians destroyed their homes, pushed them out, and because there were large families lived in their apartments, they kind of ruined things. And so the older Germans that lived there really were not happy with the Estonians. Annele told me her experiences. Her mother stayed in Geis16, and she went to school there, so she's half German, half Estonian. She said some of the teachers, when they found out, and she was born in 1950, when the teachers found out she was Estonian, they gave her a hard time because they didn't like Estonians at all. They thought we were like gypsies. I walked around with a camera in Geis16, which is actually a small town. Population is maybe 15,000, 20,000. So here I was walking around in the middle of the winter. It had snowed about a foot or so the day before. People noticed me right away, and so Annele got a call the second day I was there, that there was a reporter that wanted to interview me, and I said I would be happy to, have an interview. So I met the reporter at Annele's apartment, and she asked me the typical questions, why, and it's interesting. She asked me how I was able to find, where I lived in 1945. And I said, that was easy. Geis16 hasn't changed that much in 60 years. And I showed her pictures that I had from 1945, my backyard on Hospital Wheeler, and pictures, of today. Backyard looks almost identical. So I said, in the United States, you wouldn't recognize a place 60 years later. War didn't destroy anything, because it was a tiny little town in Bavaria, so it wasn't bombed, nothing was destroyed. Interesting information was, Annele told me that the factory that produces silverware actually produced weapons for the German army, and they buried them in that hill there over by the school. That's why there's no houses developed on that hill. And that's another way I could identify where, like, Thomas Vaga lived, because that hill looks exactly the same as it did in the 1945 photograph that he showed me. Jan Halle came to my research through Ilo Ranpalu. And Janhala is in the booklet, Kolmasta Geis16. There's a picture of it there, and I had sent some of those pictures to Ilo Ranpalu, and he's in that graduating class, that picture that there. And it's an interesting building, and then further research, people told me that the plays were there, the graduations were all there. So I knew that was an important building to the Estonians that lived in Geis16. So I wanted to get inside, but at the time they were having some kind of dance rehearsals in there, and I didn't really go inside to take.
What was this?
Ulandschule,
And what grades?
from 1 to 4.
1 to 4. And people from Willem Konko went here?
A large school in town, I was told by the kids that attended there in Annalay that everybody went there. There were kindergartens all over the place. Like each section had their own little kindergartens, but I think once you reach first grade, all the students went to that big school. And we all, I think everybody, it stands out in Geis16 because it's a 3-story building, and it's orange now. I don't know what color it was back then, but it stands out. So I took pictures of it just because it just looked interesting, and I found out later that it was the school, so I did videotape it. The train station looks like it did in 1945. Even though we lived in the 3 different sections of Geis16, we all knew where the train station was because actually we didn't all come in by train. I always thought we came in by train, but my mother and other people confirmed that most of us came in by army trucks. And there are some photographs that show people coming in, on these army transport trucks. And I think I did some more research, and I found that I don't think most people, families, didn't come in by train. But we all knew where the train station was.
May